Hey listeners, this is Peter, and welcome back to the History Shorts. Today's episode is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the world. Download Podcast Republic today, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. Today on History Shorts. After this day in history, we'll move on to the story of the Sultana. More Americans died in the explosion of the steamboat Sultana than in the sinking of the Titanic. Yet almost no one learns about it in school. Few people can even name the ship, and most Americans alive today have never heard of the deadliest maritime disaster in all of U.S. history. It didn't happen during a war at sea, it didn't involve enemy attacks, it didn't take place in the ocean at all, actually. It happened 3 weeks after the end of the American Civil War, on the Mississippi River, aboard an overcrowded, badly maintained steamboat carrying nearly 2,000 recently released Union prisoners of war. We will then finish today's episode with a history brief, dealing with a new acquisition at the Holocaust Museum. A quick word from our sponsors. This day in history. On December 29, 1845, the United States admitted Texas as the 28th state. What had once been an independent republic, born from revolution against Mexico, now officially joined the Union. The move sparked celebration in Texas, but much anger in Mexico, setting the stage for the Mexican-American War less than a year later. On December 29, 1890, tragedy struck at Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. U.S. troops opened fire on a band of Lakota Sioux during an attempted disarmament, killing more than 250 men, women, and children. Story of the day. In April 1865, the United States was exhausted. Richmond had fallen. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. The bloodiest conflict in American history, more than 600,000 dead, was finally winding to a close. Tens of thousands of Union soldiers, many of them recently liberated from Confederate prison camps, were finally going home. Among the most desperate were the survivors of Andersonville, one of the South's most notorious POW camps. Many weighed less than 100 pounds. Some were barefoot. Some were sick with scurvy, dysentery, and typhoid. They had endured starvation, exposure, torture, and months of confinement. The war was over, and all they wanted was to go home. The U.S. government began transporting released prisoners north from Vicksburg, Mississippi by riverboat, the fastest route back to the industrial north, where trains could then carry them to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and beyond. One of the steamboats contracted for this mission was the Sultana, a wooden-hulled paddle-wheel steamer built in 1863, just 2 years earlier. At 260 feet long, it was designed to legally carry about 376 passengers. On April 24, 1865, when it left Vicksburg, it was carrying more than 2,100 people. That number, nearly 6 times its legal capacity, was not an accident. It was actually the direct result of bribery. The U.S. Army was paying steamboat owners $5 per enlisted man and $10 per officer that they transported north, the equivalent of thousands of dollars today. The more men a captain crammed onto his boat, the more money he made. The officer in charge of prisoner transport at Vicksburg, Captain Reuben Hatch, had been accused repeatedly of graft and war profiteering. He should have been court-martialed long before 1865. But he wasn't, because he had political friends in Washington, including Abraham Lincoln's Illinois Patronage Network. So when the Sultana's captain, J.C. Mason, offered Hatch a kickback in exchange for receiving the POW transport contract, Hatch approved the Sultana, even though other, safer steamers were available, and even though the Sultana needed repairs. Hatch would later claim the chaos of wartime justified his decision. Survivors called it murder by greed. Just before departure, one of the Sultana's 4 boilers was discovered to be leaking. A proper repair would have taken several days, time the captain did not want to lose, because he knew another riverboat might arrive and take the paying passengers instead. So, a local mechanic offered a quick patch. Not a replacement, just a hammered-up metal seal to temporarily stop the leak. Captain Mason agreed, and the ship was cleared to sail. The lead engineer later testified that he warned Mason the boilers were dangerously overpressurized and quite unstable. Mason reportedly replied, "We are overloaded, but the men must be gotten home." Eyewitnesses described the Sultana as a floating human wall, soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder, sleeping on decks, stairways, and on the roof. The men were thin, sick, malnourished, but joyous. They sang songs, they cheered. After all, they were going home. Private Henry Luff, who had survived an infamous Confederate prison, wrote in a letter, "We cared nothing for the crowding. We were going home." The Sultana steamed north, stopping briefly in Helena, Arkansas, where a photographer captured what would become the last known image of the ship. A black and white print showing every inch of railing covered in men, smiling and waving. Hours later, most of them would be dead. The Sultana had been fighting the spring floodwaters of the Mississippi, a river swollen with rain and melting snow. The strong current forced the boilers to work harder, burning more coal, building more steam pressure. A little after 1 a.m., on April 27, 1865, just north of Memphis, Tennessee, the patched boiler failed. It ruptured with the force of a small cannon blast. The explosion triggered a chain reaction. One boiler ruptured, then another, then a third. Superheated steam and shrapnel ripped through the center of the ship. The blast tore passengers apart, ignited coal stores, and turned wooden decks into flaming wreckage. It was, as one survivor said, as if hell itself had opened beneath us. Hundreds were killed instantly. Others were blown into the air and into the river. Burning timbers collapsed into sleeping soldiers. The center of the ship disappeared in a column of fire. Those who survived the blast now faced a second terror, the Mississippi River at flood stage, in the dark, with freezing water and deadly currents. Of the 2,100 people aboard, fewer than 700 would survive. Some could not swim, some tried to cling to floating wreckage, and some drowned after the weakened bodies gave out in the cold. Others burned to death before they could jump. One survivor later recalled, "Men who had endured the worst of war now begged God to let them die quickly." Rescue boats did not arrive until dawn. Even then, bodies continued to float downriver for days, washed up along embankments as far as 100 miles downstream. Local farmers buried the dead in mass graves. No federal disaster relief existed. No post-war counseling. No compensation for families. Most mothers and wives received a letter. Nothing more. The men who had survived the Confederacy's deadliest prison camps had died as free men, within sight of friendly territory. The Sultana exploded on April 27, 1865. Well, what else was happening that month, you might ask? And that's probably why you've never heard about it. Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated on April 14th. John Wilkes Booth was killed on April 26th, just a day before the Sultana disaster. Jefferson Davis was still at large, and Congress was preparing for Reconstruction. Newspapers gave the Sultana only a fraction of the front page, devoted entirely to Lincoln, Booth, and at the end of the war. The greatest maritime disaster in American history was buried on page 3. Years later, when survivors held reunions in the Midwest, journalists asked the same question again and again. How did the country forget you? And their answer was nearly always the same. We were simply the last tragedy of the war, and the country was too tired to care. I should mention that Captain Mason, the Sultana's commander, was killed in the explosion, and so were several crew members who could have been charged. The man who should have faced trial, Captain Reuben Hatch, he was protected. Survivors demanded accountability, and families demanded hearings. Congress even opened an inquiry, and then allowed Hatch to walk free. You might ask why. Well, that's because Hatch's patronage file, the one showing political connections to Lincoln's administration, was quietly removed from the record. Blame was shifted to low-level engineers, foggy weather, or just unpredictable nature of boilers. Hatch did resign, he went home, and he collected his pension. He died in 1871, never having been arrested or even formally censored. No one was punished for the deaths of 1,700 men. The History Brief. Earlier this month, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington unveiled an artifact that carries a deeply human history. The fountain pen once held by Erno Spiegel, a Hungarian Jew who used it to help save dozens of children at Auschwitz-Birkenau during the Holocaust. Spiegel and his twin sister arrived at Auschwitz in the spring of 1944, where Nazi guards and the infamous doctor Joseph Mengele, known to victims as the Angel of Death, singled out twins for brutal experimentation. Most people who arrived at the camp, children, the elderly, the sick, were murdered almost immediately. But twins, Mengele believed, offered a grisly laboratory for his pseudoscientific genetic research. Spiegel was assigned to oversee some of these children. When he told German officers he needed a pen to do his work, they let him retrieve his own. And that pen became something much more than ink and metal. With it, Spiegel falsified records, preserved names, and helped dozens of young prisoners avoid anonymity and death. In some cases, he even deliberately miswrote documents to protect them. Years later, Spiegel's daughter, Judith Richter, donated the pen to the Holocaust Museum, describing it not as a mere writing tool, but as a weapon used to fight Nazi brutality, a means to preserve names instead of numbers, and a quiet act of resistance against the machinery of dehumanization. A new documentary about Spiegel's life and courage, The Last Twins, premiered alongside the donation. The film tells the story of Spiegel's efforts to protect children, some of whom came to view him as a guardian, an uncle, or even a father figure. Thank you so much for spending some time with me again today and helping to make this little show a mighty success. Keep spreading the word. If you need to contact me or have a question or a suggestion, you can always email me at peter@historyshortspodcast.com or look for History Shorts at www.historyshortspodcast.com on Facebook, X, and Patreon. Have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you all again tomorrow.